The lights inside the Manhattan studio were bright, too bright, maybe. The kind that made polished smiles look synthetic and tension impossible to hide. The studio audience buzzed with anticipation, their seats packed for a new episode of The Political Pulse, a televised debate show known for fiery clashes and viral soundbites. At center stage stood Jessica Tarlov, media-savvy, sharp-tongued, and proudly progressive. With her crisp blazer and rapid-fire delivery, she'd made a career dismantling what she saw as outdated ideologies with logic and flair. Tonight, her target was clear. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana had agreed to join the panel. And Tarlov, prepped and primed, was ready. He entered stage left wearing a dark blue suit and his trademark understated grin. No flashy entourage, no pages of notes, just a pocket constitution and the drawl of someone who made peace with being underestimated. "Senator Kennedy, welcome," Tarlov said, her tone polite but tight. "Glad you could join us here in the 21st century." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Kennedy simply nodded. "Ma'am," he said, "thank you for having me in whatever century this is." More laughter. But not all of it mocking. The moderator smiled, sensing tension worth capitalizing on. Tonight's topic, morality in modern politics. A loaded subject. Let's get right into it. Tarlov leaned forward, already in attack mode. "Senator, you've said America has a spiritual sickness. Isn't it dangerous, maybe even anti-democratic, for a lawmaker to make moral judgments about an entire country?" Kennedy raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that what you do on cable news every night?" The crowd reacted, a low gasp mixed with a few knowing chuckles. Tarlov didn't flinch. "I don't legislate, you do. You speak about right and wrong, as if you've cornered the market on morality." Kennedy adjusted his tie but didn't look flustered. "I just say what my grandma taught me," he said. "Don't lie. Don't cheat. Don't hurt people." Seems like we started calling that controversial instead of decent. There it was. The first swing in what would become a heavyweight exchange, not of policy points, but of principles. Tarlov was ready to escalate. What she didn't know was that Kennedy wasn't here to debate morality. He was here to defend it, Southern style. Jessica Tarlov didn't blink. Her gaze narrowed behind designer frames as she sat forward, elbows resting on the polished studio desk. Kennedy might have fired the first shot with his grandmother's wisdom, but she came armed with research, statistics, and a practiced ability to dismantle conservative talking points with surgical precision. "You say America's sick," she said coolly. "But maybe the problem isn't spiritual. Maybe it's economic, social, structural. And maybe the real sickness is lawmakers pushing 1950s morality onto a 21st century nation." A few audience members applauded, sharp, affirming claps. Kennedy tilted his head slightly. He didn't like being interrupted, but he didn't rush. That wasn't his way. "Well, Miss Jessica," he replied, his voice slow as molasses but edged with steel, "if it's the 1950s to say parents ought to raise their kids, men ought to keep their word, and leaders ought to tell the truth, then maybe the 1950s deserve an apology." A low, surprised murmur rolled through the crowd. Tarlov leaned in. "You're oversimplifying deep systemic problems. You want the world to bend to your personal beliefs and call it truth. That's not leadership, Senator. That's control." Kennedy let out a soft breath, then nodded slowly. "You ever been to Lafayette, Louisiana?" he asked. Tarlov blinked. "No. Well, I have. There's a woman there named Dolores. She runs a food pantry out of her garage. She's got 2 teeth, a third-grade education, and more moral clarity than half of Washington." Jessica shifted, sensing what he was doing, storytelling. Humanizing his stance. It was a move she'd seen work before, especially with folks watching from home. "She doesn't have a political degree," Kennedy continued. "But she knows stealing's wrong. She knows letting a baby starve while Congress debates committee procedure is wrong. She doesn't call that control. She calls it common sense. The crowd fell silent, not convinced, but curious. Tarlov saw it. Kennedy wasn't playing politics. He was telling stories. And worse, he was good at it. Time to strike back. So let me ask you, Senator, she said, her tone sharp, do you think someone like me, with my beliefs, my background, my values, is immoral? The room froze. That was the move. Put him on the defensive. Force a line he wouldn't want to cross. Kennedy didn't blink. I think you're wrong, ma'am, he said calmly. But I wouldn't call you immoral. He looked directly at her, no smirk, no sarcasm. Disagreement ain't hate. And conviction ain't cruelty. I'm not here to win a fight, I'm here to stand on something that doesn't change with the weather. The audience sat still, caught between philosophies and drawn into something deeper than debate. Tarlov folded her hands. She was just getting started. But so was Kennedy. The studio air felt heavier now. There were no camera cuts, no artificial tension. Just two people locked in a quiet war, one waged not with shouting, but with conviction. Jessica adjusted her mic discreetly. Her next words came slower. Not out of hesitation, but strategy. You say you're not here to win a fight, Senator, she said. But you walk into every room with a moral measuring stick, deciding who's right, who's wrong, and who's lost their way. Kennedy didn't answer right away. That was his strength. He didn't fill silence. He made people lean into it. He finally spoke, voice low and unhurried. Jessica, I'm not the one who said there are no moral absolutes. You did. I just live like there are. Gasps. A few in the audience even chuckled, not mockingly, but with surprise. It wasn't often that someone threw Tarlov off rhythm. She raised her eyebrows. So people like me don't have values? No, ma'am, he said. I think you've got values. But values built on popularity polls blow over when the wind changes. Mine were carved on a mountain. The moderator leaned forward. This was getting good. Viral good. Jessica wasn't done. Let me be clear. I believe in kindness. Inclusion. Freedom of choice. Those are my values, and I didn't need religion to get them. Kennedy nodded slowly. I believe in kindness too. And truth. And responsibility, but I didn't invent them. I inherited them, from faith, from family, from failure. He paused, his voice warming. Your beliefs make you passionate. That's clear. Mine make me anchored. That's the difference. The moderator jumped in, sensing an opportunity. Senator, are you saying Jessica's beliefs aren't anchored? Kennedy didn't flinch. I'm saying a compass works best when it points to something outside yourself. Jessica's eyes flared, not in anger, but in recognition. That line cut, not because it insulted her, but because it forced the question she tried hard to avoid. What's my compass actually pointing to? The studio was no longer just a soundstage. It was a courtroom of ideas. And the jury, millions watching online, weren't looking for stats. They were looking for sincerity, and whether they agreed with Kennedy or not, they were finding it. Jessica straightened. She knew how to pivot. And this wasn't over. She was about to make it personal. Jessica's voice sharpened. She'd had enough of stories and metaphors. If Kennedy wanted a moral discussion, fine, but it wouldn't be wrapped in folksy charm. She reached down, pulling a folded sheet of notes from beneath her tablet. Senator, she said, you speak about truth and personal responsibility. But what about your voting record? You've supported legislation that critics say punishes the poor, rolls back protections, and marginalizes vulnerable communities. Her tone was surgical now. Professional. The edge of a prosecutor, not a pundit. You talk about faith, but what kind of faith turns its back on people who are hurting? The room tightened. Kennedy didn't move, but the smile had faded. Jessica pressed. You say you're standing on something timeless. But maybe you're just hiding behind it. The audience murmured. This was the punch many had come to see. Kennedy sat still. Then slowly leaned forward, setting both elbows on the desk, his voice dropping half an octave. "Miss Jessica," he said, "you don't know what I've seen." His tone was different now, not defiant. Not even defensive. Just heavier. "I've watched a single mother in Plaquemines Parish wash blood off her porch after her boy was shot in a drive-by. I've prayed with coal miners who couldn't breathe but showed up to vote anyway. And I've stood in hospitals where the air smells like bleach and heartbreak." Jessica blinked, just for a second. Kennedy wasn't just pivoting. He was digging deeper than expected. "I vote for what I believe will help them," he continued. "I don't always get it right. I'm not God. But I don't need a lecture on compassion from someone who's never knocked on their door." It landed hard. Because it wasn't angry. It was personal. Jessica regrouped, her voice cooler now. "So your choices come from compassion. But when they harm people, does it still count as moral?" Kennedy looked her in the eye. "You ever held a man's hand while he dies because the rehab center he needed was shut down 2 governors ago?" Silence. "I have. And I still ask myself if I did enough." That moment pulled the oxygen out of the room. For a second, the debate format cracked, and 2 human beings were just vulnerable. Jessica's shoulders eased. But she wasn't surrendering. She just saw that Kennedy wasn't here to play hero. He was here to be accountable. And now it was her turn to face something uncomfortable. The debate wasn't about who had the cleaner resume. It was about who was willing to bleed for what they believed. The lights in the studio hadn't changed, but everything else had. What started as a televised debate was now something heavier, a reckoning wrapped in political rhetoric. Kennedy's last words had slowed the pace, introduced something rarely seen on screens like this: soul. Jessica stared at him, quiet. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she hadn't expected him to go there. The moderator, visibly stunned, let the silence stretch. Finally, Jessica straightened. Her voice came softer now, but no less sharp. "You say you've seen pain. So have I," she said. "I've been to clinics where women cried in parking lots because they had no one to stand by them. I've talked to kids, LGBTQ kids, who were told by their own families that they were an abomination." She swallowed. "I don't say that to score points. I say it because when we talk about morality, we don't get to pick who deserves protection." Kennedy nodded once. Respectfully. "I agree," he said. "Every person's got dignity. That's why I'm careful with what I call moral. 'Cause if I call everything good, eventually I'm saying nothing's sacred." Jessica folded her arms. "But who decides what's sacred, Senator? You? A book written thousands of years ago? A church?" He leaned back. "No, ma'am. I don't decide. And I sure didn't write the book. But I trust the one who did." The audience was silent again, locked in. Some shook their heads. Others leaned forward. Whatever side they stood on, they knew they were witnessing more than a soundbite war. This was personal belief exposed to national scrutiny. Jessica pressed on. "Then what do you say to people who don't believe what you do? Who still want dignity and rights and safety? Do they just not count?" Kennedy's voice was quiet now, but immovable. "They count more than you know. That's why I tell the truth even when it's unpopular. Love without truth is just sentiment. And truth without love is just noise. I'm trying to walk the line between them." Jessica's eyes flickered. Not in defeat, but in realization. This wasn't a man trying to legislate morality into lawbooks. This was someone who had seen both beauty and tragedy, and still believed in something unshakable. And for the first time, she respected it. The moderator finally stepped in. "We'll be back after the break. When we return, what does it mean to lead with values in today's America?" The lights dimmed. The commercial cue flashed. But the real drama, it wasn't scripted. Jessica sat quietly. Kennedy stared ahead. And the audience wasn't watching a debate anymore. They were watching two Americans asking, "What's worth standing for, when everything's on fire?" When the cameras came back on, something had shifted. The studio lights still cast the same golden glow. The audience remained quiet, eyes locked on the stage. But the tone, unmistakably, had deepened. The moderator, sensing the moment, didn't open with a new question. He simply said, "We're back." Jessica sat poised, but not performative. She looked at Kennedy, not as a caricature of the opposition, but as a man who'd earned something rare in politics, attention without spectacle. "I think we've both made something clear tonight," she said slowly. "Neither of us is playing a role." Kennedy gave a slight nod. "I don't know how to." Jessica smiled, just barely. "I used to think people like you were all the same. Stuck in a time that doesn't fit anymore. But now I see something else. You're not stuck. You've just decided what not to let go of." Kennedy looked over, genuinely intrigued. "I'll take that as a compliment," he said. "Don't get ahead of yourself," she quipped, her grin widening. "You still voted against half the things I believe in. And you've defended some things I don't understand," he replied. They weren't sparring anymore. They were searching. The moderator leaned forward. "So what does that mean, for our politics, our culture, our future, when two people from opposite ends can do this?" Jessica answered first. "It means disagreement doesn't have to mean dehumanizing." Kennedy followed. "And conviction doesn't require cruelty." There was a pause. No applause signs were needed. The audience clapped on instinct, slowly at first, then steadily. Jessica looked at Kennedy again. "You're not gonna change my mind on a lot," she said. He nodded. "Wouldn't expect to. But I'll say this," she continued, "if more people showed up like you did tonight, quietly firm, not looking to win but to explain, we'd have fewer shouting matches and more conversations." Kennedy leaned in, his drawl still thick but his tone soft. "Well, Miss Jessica, you hit hard," he said. "But you don't hit cheap." Her eyes flickered. That meant something. Because in a world where every debate feels like a performance, this one had started to look like truth. Not agreement. Not unity. But truth, told from both sides, without apology. And maybe that was more powerful than winning. The applause faded, but the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was waiting. In the front row, a man stood. Late 30s. Tight jaw. Eyes sharp. "Excuse me," he said loudly. "This is nice and all, but being civil doesn't fix policy. One of you fights for my rights. The other votes against them. So which one of you is actually helping me?" The moderator hesitated. Jessica looked at him first. "That's a fair question," she said. "Because empathy doesn't replace action." She turned to Kennedy. "You and I found respect tonight. But that doesn't erase our votes. Our choices have consequences." Kennedy nodded. "You're right. Civility ain't a solution. It's just the start of being heard." He stood slightly taller, then addressed the man in the crowd directly. "I won't pretend every vote I've cast helped you. But I will say this, I don't vote to hurt. I vote from a belief I answer for, not to Twitter, not to party donors, but to the people I meet. People like you." The room was still. The man didn't sit yet. "And if your belief is wrong?" he asked. Kennedy didn't blink. "Then I pray I see it before someone else pays for it." It was honest. No spin. And for a moment, the room stopped trying to take sides. Because for the first time, both Tarlov and Kennedy were standing, not behind podiums, but beside the people watching. After the exchange with the man in the crowd, the tone of the room changed once again, not toward tension, but toward reflection. Jessica turned to the moderator. "This is what we miss in politics. Not just policies, but what's underneath them. The why behind the vote. She faced Kennedy. You said something earlier, about truth without love being noise. That stuck with me. But there's another side to that. Love without courage becomes silence. Kennedy looked at her, eyes narrowed with thought. Then I reckon we both need to walk that line. Jessica nodded. So let's stop pretending we're just here to debate issues. We're here to show people what values in action look like. The moderator leaned in. Then let me ask both of you, what's one value you would never compromise on? Kennedy spoke first. Redemption, he said plainly. That people can change. That they deserve the chance. Jessica followed. Equality, she said firmly. No exceptions. Everyone gets a seat at the table, or the table needs to be flipped. Kennedy smirked. Sounds like my grandma's Thanksgiving. Jessica chuckled despite herself. The tension melted, if only for a moment. Then she added, more serious, we're probably never going to agree on the how. Kennedy nodded. But maybe, just maybe, we can stop judging folks for where they start. The audience didn't erupt. They just absorbed. Because this wasn't the climax they expected. It was the one they needed. The moderator thanked both guests. The official segment was over. Theme music rolled, the credits cued, but no one left their seat. Jessica stood first, smoothing her blazer. She looked at Kennedy, not as an opponent, not even as a colleague, but as someone who had just weathered the same storm. Senator, she said quietly, I didn't expect this. He gave a half smile. I rarely deliver what folks expect. She offered a hand. You believe deeply. I don't agree with your beliefs, but I respect that you showed up with them. He shook her hand without hesitation. And you stood your ground without slinging mud. That's rare in our business. The crew started packing up. Staff whispered. But the moment between the two stayed intact. Kennedy turned toward the quiet studio, now dimmed. They'll clip the loudest parts. The sparks. Not the stillness. Jessica nodded. They always do. But that stillness, that's where people think. That's where change starts. A producer called from the side, prompting Jessica to exit for the next segment. She paused. Senator, she said, glancing back, this won't be the last time we're on opposite sides. He tipped his head. I'd be disappointed if it were. As she left the stage, Kennedy remained for a moment. Alone in the fading lights, he pulled a small notebook from his jacket. A line was scribbled at the top of a page. Truth without love is noise. He underlined it. Then added beneath. But love without courage is silence. He closed the book. Pocketed it. And walked off stage. There was no crowd waiting. No press gaggle. Just a man with convictions, and a respect newly earned. The broadcast was over. The lights dimmed. But something hung in the air, something you don't get from a typical political clash. Two people, forged from different worlds, different beliefs, had done something rare, they had listened without folding. Later that night, the clip of Kennedy quoting scripture beside Tarlov's fierce defense of equality went viral. Not because it was outrageous. But because it was honest. No shouting match. No walk-offs. Just a conversation where neither side gave up their spine, but neither lost their soul either. And for millions watching at home, something stirred. They saw that truth isn't about domination. It's about endurance. That respect doesn't mean surrender. And that maybe, just maybe, conviction can be spoken without contempt. Kennedy returned to the Senate floor the next day with no press conference. Tarlov appeared on her next panel with the same fire, but a different kind of tone. One sharpened by empathy, not just strategy. They didn't become allies. They became examples. In an age of outrage, they chose dialogue over destruction. And the internet noticed. Clapperboard. So ask yourself. What would happen if we stopped trying to win every argument, and started trying to understand the person across from us? Because in the end, shouting fades. But courage? Courage leaves a mark.